We've been introduced. I'm JJ. This is Nita. In true theater kid fashion, I'm going to improvise a lot of our talk today, but I'm pretty lucky. We've known each other since, gosh, how long now?
Oh God, it's at least 6 years.
Oh my God. Where does time go? Well, half of it went down the pandemic. But,
yeah.
So we actually met. Was it before I was published too?
Yeah. Yes. Because I read a draft of Winter Song when it was still an adult.
That's right. When it still had the spicy scenes intact. Yes. Yeah. So we've been on a publishing journey, kind of not entirely in tandem, but like alongside each other. We've known each other for a long time, so it's a real honor to be here to be launching their first book in person. So let's give them another round of applause. All right, so actually, do you want to talk about your first book, since it didn't quite get the love in person that your second book is going to get?
Yeah.
So why don't you give us like a quick log line or pitch of your debut novel?
Oh, great. Okay. Let's see if I can remember how to do this. So my first novel, Who I Was With Her, came out in 2020 in September, so in the height of the pandemic. It is about a bisexual cross-country runner named Corinne, whose secret girlfriend Maggie dies. And because nobody knew they were dating, Corinne has nobody to turn to when Maggie dies, except for Maggie's ex-girlfriend, Alyssa, who might be the one person who actually understands what she's going through. So they grow closer because of that, and a lot of it is about like her journey through that grief and everything.
I like that you said earlier that your brand is Sad Gay.
It is. It's my entire brand.
It's your entire brand. Because, I mean, Who I Was With Her is a contemporary book. Mm-hmm. And obviously, Nothing Sung and Nothing Spoken is a historical novel. So I want to talk a little bit about that shift. Well, the first question I want to ask you is, have you seen Swing Kids?
Yes, I've seen Swing Kids.
Okay. So, how many of y'all have seen Swing Kids? Okay.
Okay, great. Four of you. Great, excellent.
We're on the same page.
It's on Disney Plus, so you should watch it.
100% recommend. It's great. Apologies for the copy. So, were you at all inspired by Swing Kids?
Yes. Okay, so my dad is forever like showing me movies and showing me things that he thinks I would be interested in. And he was like, "You like German, you like music, I really like this movie, we're going to watch it." So we did, and we watched Swing Kids, and the entire time we're watching it, I was like, A, this could be gay. B, where are the girls in this? Because I know girls had to have been part of this movement. And I was like, man, I should really write that. I don't think anyone's done that yet. So I was like, I'll write Swing Kids, but gay and with girls. And my publisher was like, great, we'll take it. And here we are.
So aside from just the idea sparking in you, so really it is directly inspired by Swing Kids. I love that so much. Like the musical theater kid in me really loves that. So then going from contemporary to historical, what were the biggest differences aside from the research? Because we all know that research goes into it, but I want to talk a little bit more about the actual writing, because I think what connects both of your books is you have a really beautiful, lyrical voice, and that voice connects both of your books. And does that change, or do you consciously think about it if the setting is contemporary or if the setting is historical?
Oh, thank you. So I think, again, thanks. I don't know. I think for me it was, at least with Nothing Sung, it was something I was a little more conscious of in that I deliberately did not want to be anachronistic when writing that one. So whereas with Who I Was With Her, when I could basically write it kind of the way that I thought as a teenager, albeit with a lot more swearing, Nothing Sung, I had to kind of very deliberately step away from that particular side of it. I did lean a little bit more into okay, what is the language that they would have used, especially knowing that my character's first language would not be English. So kind of also keeping that in the back of my head as well as okay, I need to make this sound maybe a little bit more old-fashioned, but at the same time, because that lyrical style is the thing that I do well and the thing that I enjoy doing, I was like, I don't want to get away from that too much, because to me that is the thing that kind of ties together all of my books.
Then they're sad and they're gay.
And they're sad and they're gay,
right?
Yeah.
I want to actually talk too, because you also speak German, or the German language is a big thing for you. And did any of the rhythms, I'm always fascinated by this because I also speak other languages aside from English. And I always try to infuse my books with like the flavor of the language, which is obviously going to be different from speaker to speaker, person to person, and people who are familiar with the language and who are not. So did that also consciously affect any of the choices? And what would you say is the flavor of the German language?
Ooh, okay. Sorry, I don't know where my voice is going.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Thanks, JJ. So that did actually influence the book. I deliberately did try to write like, not like a German speaker, but a little bit. There's a part in the narration where my narrator Charlie is talking about like her sister with some friends, and she's like, oh, they are all talking as quickly as a waterfall. That is a German expression. We would not say that in English. And I was like, I just want to translate this directly to give that sort of sense of these are not native speakers. The one thing I enjoy about reading like translated fiction into English is it reads like it is not English. And that's kind of the sort of style that I wanted to get at with this book. The characters do tend to be a little bit more direct in the way that Germans are, in the way that Americans are absolutely not, especially Southern Americans. We will do everything except say exactly how we feel. We will just talk around it kind of the entire time. Germans don't do that. Germans are like, this is very upsetting and I do not like this. And Americans are like, oh, this was fine. I mean, it wasn't that bad, this is fine, but Germans don't do that. So I did try to go a little bit more with that style as far as how I would describe the German language. I actually think I'm besides direct, I actually think it's very rich and it's very pretty. I don't want to say angry. I don't want to buy into that stereotype that German is just angry and a lot of harsh sounds and a lot of, like sounds, because that's actually Dutch, it's not German. But to me, it's still, even though it's this very direct language, it's still very poetic. There's this part, both in Nothing Sung and also just kind of a stereotype in general that Germans have a word for everything, which is true. I think that's kind of how I would characterize it.
Yeah, I would actually describe German. I wouldn't say it's harsh sounding either. I actually, in my opinion, think French is kind of harsh sounding. It's really guttural. Like people think, oh, French is very mellifluous and pretty, and I'm like,
is it?
Is it though?
Oh, sorry, Kate. You speak French.
But I agree. I think German is, what I love about German as a language is incredibly descriptive. The fact that they do essentially have a word for everything. For a long time, I was obsessed with collecting German compound nouns because they're just so descriptive. And it's just two words that they've mushed together. Like, I think probably the most well-known that everyone knows is Schadenfreude, which is, like pain and joy, which is the pain you feel or the joy you feel in someone else's pain. But there's other examples of this. I'm trying to think of a couple off the top of my head. There's Sitzfleisch, which is sitting strength, which is the ability to sit through something boring. Like this meeting took a lot of Sitzfleisch. You just sort of have to kind of really muscle your way through that kind of thing. It's just an incredibly descriptive, yet very direct language, because I think English as a language tends to be a bit more metaphorical when we talk about it. But German tends to be very descriptive, but in very direct ways, but they put the words together in a very interesting and unusual way. Yeah. All right, so you studied abroad in Austria, right?
So I did a Fulbright teaching.
Oh, yeah, Fulbright teaching.
Yeah.
Did you write any of this while you were living there?
So by the time I got there, I was in the developmental edits stage of this. So I was doing a large chunk of editing and stuff, but most of the drafting was done here in the US.
Did anything change when you were, like, after having lived there and experienced the culture and the people? Did anything change while you were doing the developmental edits?
Yeah, so I lived in Austria for a year, but before that I actually took a week-long trip to Berlin, which is where the book is set, and I went around through Charlottenburg, through Kreuzberg, through all the different districts of Berlin where I've set the book, so I could get more of the flavor, more of the feeling, and more of the description, which tends to be my Achilles heel as a writer. I don't like describing buildings or people or clothing or anything. So I was like, okay, I have to go walk around here and to actually get this atmosphere and this vibe, even though it's 2021 and not 1938. At least, it's Berlin. There are parts of the buildings and the streets that are still there from 1938. So I wanted to make sure that I had a lot more of that depth when I was there.
So the other part I wanted to ask you was about World War II. Mm-hmm. It's obviously going to be a bit of a fraught topic. I think particularly with sort of rise of fascistic governments and tendencies around the world, I think it's a very heavy subject to tackle. Was it cathartic to you? Because the journey, of course, a lot of times we hear a World War II novel and we think it's probably going to be about the Holocaust, right? It's going to be about a specific aspect of the war, but other people were obviously part of this war. Like The Book Thief is, one of my favorite novels, and the Holocaust is, of course, a big part of that book, but it is told from a German girl's point of view. And being part of the swing youth movement, that dealing with the rise of fascism and where the current events as you were writing, did you think about that as you were writing, or did you discover new things about yourself, or maybe the world that we live in, or even the world that they were living in because of the time we're living in now?
It was, on one hand, it was cathartic. On the other hand, there were times I could not work on this book because I was writing it. My first draft of this was written primarily during November 2020.
Yikes.
Yeah. Not a great time. And there were times I had to email my editor actually and be like, Stephanie, I need an extension. I can't work on this book right now. Like I need to put it up and work on something happier because of everything that's going on right now. So part of it was cathartic and part of it was also just terrifying because when I'm doing this research, because so much of Nothing Sung focuses on the everyday life of Germans during the war. I deliberately did not want to write a Holocaust book. I'm not Jewish. I did not want to touch that. Plenty of other really wonderful books have been written about that particular experience. And I was reading this particular book called They Thought They Were Free, the Germans from 1933 to 45. I think it's by Milton Maya. I don't remember, apologies to him. But there's this part in the book that stuck with me, and it was when Hitler was first coming to power in the 1930s in Germany, the sentiment in Germany was, oh, well, fascism has happened in Italy. It's happened, in Russia. It cannot happen here. It's not going to happen here in Germany. And that was the thought at the time. And obviously knowing what we know now about what happened in Germany under Hitler's rule, it was very, very frightening to see that same sort of sentiment that I've seen echo here. Like, oh, well, that kind of thing just doesn't happen in America. It doesn't happen here. It can't happen here. And to see those parallels in between the two of them was genuinely kind of terrifying.
Well, it sort of makes you think about if, 30 years in the future, people are writing historical fiction about the 2020s, right? The late teens, early 2020s, what they would make of us, right? We're living through it, so we don't have the perspective to say anything, right? Because it's easy for us looking back on Nazi Germany to be like, how could they not see this? How could you be complicit in the system? When we live in a country that has stolen land from indigenous people and was built on the blood of slaves, like, we are complicit simply by being American. So, I think there is a lot of room for nuance, obviously, without, what is the word I'm looking for? Sorry, ADHD brain, sometimes words just fly out and don't come back. Without condoning, there we go, condoning the actions, right? We think about that. And I also, I'm sure because Nita and I are musical theater people, you've seen Cabaret.
Yes. It's my favorite.
Also my favorite. See, this is why Nita and I are friends, actually. We have a lot of musical theater in common. I think that was how we became friends.
I think that is how we became friends, because I went over to your house and we watched musical theater bootlegs.
We did.
On your TV.
We did. We watched Todd's de Vampire. We watched Spring Awakening,
yep.
the Deaf West version. I think that might be it.
It might have been it, yeah. Because the first thing you showed me from Todd's de Vampire was the garlic song.
That's right.
Which was an experience.
It is. The whole musical is an experience. If you guys don't know Todd's de Vampire, we're going to go on a tangent. I apologize. But This is a musical composed entirely of Jim Steinman songs. So the most famous being, I think, Total Eclipse of the Heart. Jim Steinman was responsible for a lot of these really bombastic late 80s, early 90s power ballads. So I Would Do Anything for Love by Meatloaf is a Jim Steinman song.
Most of Meatloaf's repertoire.
Yeah, most of Meatloaf's repertoire. I mean, think of the I Would Do Anything for Love music video, and that is basically all of Jim Steinman's work. And then you just like take all of that music and then stick it into a musical about vampires. It's great.
It's on YouTube with English subtitles. If we're friends and I haven't forced you to watch it with me yet, that's happening soon.
I highly recommend it. It was brought to Broadway and flopped horribly. Michael Crawford was actually supposed to be the Count.
It was so bad.
It was so bad. It underwent so many revisions. It's actually quite famous in Broadway history for having flopped.
If you have an evening to do like a Wikipedia deep dive of how badly Dance of the Vampires as a musical flopped, please do, because it's very entertaining.
I feel like someone must have done a YouTube essay about this. If they haven't,
I think you should.
No. I have too many projects as it is. But it's incredibly fascinating. But to go back to Cabaret, right? Yeah. Cabaret is sort of a similar, it's a nightclub. I don't know if you guys have seen it or know the musical, but it's sort of, there were people who were living during the rise of the Nazi regime in Germany, and the sort of being aware of it and seeing the train wreck about to happen. But what can you possibly do, right? What can you do? And Cabaret is actually quite bleak if you think about it that way, especially the way it ends. Yeah. But sorry, excuse me. So I want to also talk about German in general.
Okay.
What draws you to the language, to the culture, and all those sorts of things?
That's a great question. I don't know. I've always been really fascinated with the language. I like I said, I think it's beautiful. I don't think it's very harsh. It makes a lot of sense when you're learning it from a linguistic perspective. It has a lot of rules, and granted, while it has so many rules, once you follow them, once you figure out what they are, it's pretty easy to construct. It's pretty easy to pronounce and put together, despite all of the rules. I couldn't tell you what drew me to German specifically, other than I really like how it sounded, and then I happened to find musicals in German and was like, oh, this will help me learn this much faster, and then it did.
Yeah, I like the gothicness of...
It is very goth. Yeah, I will say I like the gothic aspect of German in general.
Well, sorry. Because you also do translation work. Mm-hmm. And does that also require part of your writing creative brain if you're translating from German to English? And what are how do you honor original work in that language and also translate it idiomatically into English? So I do sometimes, my mother is a Korean English interpreter, so sometimes I will smooth over her translation from sort of directly translated Korean and into idiomatic English while still trying to retain the flavor of the language. So I wonder, if you've done any projects and what that process is like for you and how it sort of either helps or runs parallel with your fiction writing.
Yeah. So I think, how do I translate this idiomatically while still honoring the original language is pretty much, I think, the question that every translator is always trying to answer.
I think it's an art, actually, personally.
At any given time. I don't know, for me it comes down to making choices and spending a lot of time with the text and thinking, okay, what is at the heart of what this author is trying to get at here? So is there a better way I could translate this? Is there a way that works more, if this flows incredibly well in German and then I translate it to English and it's clunky, okay, is there something better I could make it into in English that's going to still achieve the flow of what it is in German without sacrificing the meaning or sacrificing the authorial intent? So I'm working on a project right now that's a memoir actually by a friend of mine named Linus, and he's a trans man, and he wrote a memoir about it in Germany. That was actually the first memoir by a trans person published in Germany. So I'm working on translating that into English, and trying to find a publisher for it. And it's great. I love it. He's got this very nice conversational style, and just trying to make sure that I am achieving that and achieving that same sort of conversational tone while understanding that some of the word choices, especially with German, the sentence structure is going to be completely different. I'm so sorry for getting into linguistic nerd territory up here. But for example, Germans can construct a sentence, and it can be one sentence, and it will be like 10 lines long with like commas in between every single clause, and it's one sentence. And I have to decide as a translator, am I breaking this up into several sentences because it flows better that way in English, or am I going to stay true to German and leave it as one paragraph long sentence? And usually I chunk it up to make it easier, but I don't know, it's just, sometimes I'm like, oh, did I make the right choice in translating this? And sometimes the answer is, maybe.
Yeah, that's why I think it's an art as well. It's like Korean as a language does not actually have a gendered third person pronoun at all. So it's interesting because you would often hear Korean immigrants frequently misgender people and things because there is no gendered third person pronoun in the language. So that affects just the way they relate to the world, or even the sentence structure. You can actually omit the subject of a sentence entirely, and the sentence will still make sense in Korean when you're speaking to somebody. Because I think it also goes, I also am a big language nerd, so apologies, but I think it goes to sort of how language can shape a person's thought process. Because if you are talking to a room of people and you're able to just get rid of the subject altogether and just even most of the verb and just have the modifier and still be completely understood in the sentence, to me, that indicates a sort of collectivism in the way the person engages with other people in your society. And I don't know is there something about German that you think affects the way there's a scientific term for this called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. If you guys have seen the movie Arrival or have read the short story it's based on by Ted Chiang, the short story is called This is the Story of Your Life. And the theory is that the more you become immersed in another language, the more it actually shapes the way you think. And in the case of this short story, which was a science fiction premise, these aliens, because of their sentence structure and everything, they start the beginning and end of their sentence at the same time. And it meets in the middle. So their conception of time is entirely different from that of ours, which is very linear because of the way we speak. But because of that, over time, this translator's conception of time has shifted. So now she is able to see the beginning and end of all stories at once. This story short, I highly recommend anything by Ted Chiang, by the way, or the movie Arrival, because the short story is told in 3 different tenses, but it's all happening at the same time. And she's telling the story of her daughter's life to her daughter. It's amazing. So just kind of that, is there anything specific about the language that you think maybe shaped the way you write in English?
I think I keep coming back to that directness, right? I keep coming back to that. I think my writing has gotten a little bit more plain and a little bit more clear since I started learning German, just because of that descriptiveness, of that directness, of that we're going to use a bunch of compound words smushed together into one word, but we're not going to use that very flowery sort of metaphor for talking around certain topics or certain kind of anything. So I think that for me, that's affected my writing, and then I tend to be a little more direct now when I'm writing something or when I'm working on something.
All right, I promise I'm not going to bore you all with the language stuff too much. And I do want to talk a little bit about inspiration. And now I don't like to ask all the time, like, what was the inspiration? Because clearly we talked about Swing Kids. I like to know about the alchemical process of where the idea starts and how that transforms into a novel on the page. So you had this idea and you're like, where are all the girls and why is it not gay? Yeah. Right? How do you take the idea and all the things that you want to write about, and then how do you construct a story from that? Take us through how that works for you.
So for me, I at least for YA, I usually write in first person. I usually write in present tense. Those things are like my thing, so they're not things I've consciously decided on before I write something. But I cannot start a story unless I have that first line in my head. And that is, I have to hear that before I ever start writing. So for Who I Was With Her, for example, the first line is, when I hear that she's dead, I run. That has been the first line since I drafted that book in 2015. It has not changed. The one for Nothing Sung is something like, it was the summer before the war, and that some iteration of that has stayed the same throughout all of my drafting process. So for me, I can have an idea, I can have vague thoughts of plot. I'm not much of a plotter, but if I don't have that first line, I can't start. So I have to have that for all of my books, and then I do not outline. So I had like, I vaguely outlined, I had like little bullet points of, okay, I know I want this to happen, I know I want this to happen. There's a pivotal scene near the end of the book between two of the characters that I knew I wanted to happen. That was so vague, I'm so sorry. I really don't want to spoil this. I did not know the ending. I don't know the ending of my books when I write them. I probably should. So I had that, and then from there it's just writing out a first draft. For me, I usually get stuck. I told you this, around 17,000 words. And for this one, luckily before I was writing it on deadline, I was just writing it for fun. So I scrapped those 17,000 words before I started writing it on deadline and rewrote it, which ended up working much better. But for me, that generally goes a process. I have to write linearly, because to me that's how I get the emotional beats of the story.
Right.
When I revise, I can go back and do whatever, but I have to write the first draft in chronological order. And for this book, I knew I wanted poetry to influence it, and I knew I wanted it to cover the entire scope of the war. So a lot of drafting for me was figuring out, how am I splitting this into parts? At what years am I splitting it? Obviously, I'm not going to cover all 7 years from 1938 to 1945 in one book. That would be a very long book. So at what parts am I going to summarize and shorten, and what parts am I going to lengthen? Making those type of decisions. Initially, actually, Heinrich Heine was not the poet whose work I used in this book. It was T.S. Eliot. And then I was doing some more further research and realized T.S. Eliot is horrendously anti-Semitic, which is not what you want in a book about World War II, or ever. So I switched to Heinrich Heine, and then used that poetry to kind of influence the rest of the book.
Do you hear your characters?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm the same way. It's funny listening to you talk about your process, because it's actually almost identical to mine. As in, I cannot write unless I have a first line. I hear the characters, and I write linearly.
This is why we're friends.
All right, so I want to also then talk to you about, I was listening to a podcast in the drive here called the Happy Writer Podcast by Marissa Meyer. She is the author of the Lunar Chronicles and a whole bunch of other books. But she always asks, what is your origin story as a writer? Like, what is the thing that made you realize you were a writer, made you want to become a writer? And then the other part that I don't actually think is necessarily the same thing is, what made you want to be published? Which for me are two different things. So I was wondering if it was for you.
So what made me want to be a writer was in, I think I was in either 7th or 8th grade, and I read a book called Speak by Laurie Halse Anderson. And I read that and I was like, oh my God, I want to write stuff like this. And then the following year, it was 2008 because I was in 8th grade. And then the following year I did NaNoWriMo, and I loved it. And I was like, oh, this is a thing that I really enjoy. And I also wrote fan fiction for fun as a high schooler. I still write fan fiction for fun. But I wrote
fiction for life.
Yeah. You get, some of you hear about my fan fiction, but the rest of you, you're never going to find it. Sorry.
What was the IP for it? This is very important.
That's the X-Files.
The tracks, okay.
Same. Again, this is why Nita and I are friends.
It's definitely the X-Files. I'll expose myself. Currently, it's actually the novel Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I've read so much fan fiction for that.
Amazing.
Listen, there's too much homoeroticism in that book for me to not.
Oh yeah, with
and
Mrs.
be like,
Danvers.
she's lesbian.
Absolutely.
There was too much in that for me to not look at it and be like, I'm making this gayer. Apologies to Daphne du Maurier. Actually, I think she would like it.
Yeah.
But for me, so I wrote fanfic, and that was kind of like, I really like being a writer. When I was in college, so as far as publishing journey. So when I was in college, I actually was studying to be a sign language interpreter. That was my first major, which Connor, you actually remember because I stayed with you and I had a campus visit for the major stuff. I failed out of that major my freshman year and ended up switching to English instead. And once I switched majors, I was like, oh, at that point I hadn't written for 3 or 4 years because I was like, I'm going to be an interpreter. That's what I'm going to do. That is my purpose in life. And I didn't have time to write because I was a freshman in college and had, could not control my own schedule. So after I switched majors, I was like, oh, I really should get back into writing. That was something I really enjoyed. And then in 2014, I started querying seriously. And in 2015, signed with my first agent. And then in 2017, left that agent, signed with a new one in 2018, and sold who I was with her a year later.
Mm-hmm. So is there, I'm always curious about this because I also wrote a lot when I was a kid. My origin story as a writer is that I was an only child for the first 10 and a half years of my life. And I didn't really have anybody to play with at home. So I would just make up a whole bunch of stories for myself and my stuffed animals. And then at a certain point, those stories got so convoluted I had to write them down because I was going to forget them all. So that was kind of where I say is my origin story, but I've always written for myself. And that making that leap from writing for yourself then to be writing to be read by other people, I don't know. I really struggled with my second novel because that was the first that was not truly for myself, for me. And I wonder if you felt any of those sorts of things and if you think that there is a difference between being published and then being just a writer in general.
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, writing my second novel was so hard because it was the first novel I'd written on deadline too, because for my debut, I had all the time in the world to write that. And for my second novel, we sold it on proposal, which basically means I gave my publisher a 3-page synopsis of what I thought the book was going to be and 5,000 words. And they were like, great, you have 6 months, write the whole thing. I ended up taking longer than 6 months. So for me, I was suddenly, and during that time while I was writing the draft of Nothing Sung, Who I Was With Her came out. So all of a sudden I was very, very conscious of, oh, I have an audience. I have people I have to write this for. And there was times when I was writing this and I was a little bit self-censoring in that I don't want to make these characters, particularly one of the main characters, Angelica, is the daughter of a Nazi officer. So I was like, I don't want to make her as horrible as I probably could be making her because I'm already thinking about Twitter.
Right.
And audience backlash.
The discourse.
And then I was like, I just one, I need to get off Twitter. And two, I was like, I just need to tell this story. It's not, if she's not a great person, the story's actually not going to work. She's where a lot of the central conflict of this narrative comes from. So, I don't know. For me, it's just trying to come to terms with the fact that people are going to read this. They're either going to like it or they're not. And for me, I had a lot of anxiety because this was so different from my debut. I was like, oh God, people who liked my debut aren't necessarily going to be like, great, I'm down to read a historical book in Nazi Germany that uses a lot of German. And for me, it was just, I had to, and I still struggle with this, figure out how to okay, how do I turn that off? How do I at least try to get some joy out of the process and some joy out of writing? What parts of this can I make for me without thinking about audience or whatever? And then with the book I'm working on now, I'm really, really having to stop that because my protagonist is non-binary, which I am as well. And this is the first time my protagonist has shared my identity. So now I'm like, oh, yay. I'm really having to stop thinking about.
I know, and it's always hard to to drown those voices out entirely. And I don't want to make it sound horrible, but it is somewhat that once you become published, writing is no longer pure, right? It's no longer just for you. It will never, ever be just for you again, which is why I still love fan fiction, because fan fiction is still just for me and whoever reads it on AO3. But, you know, I don't see them.
The nice thing about writing fanfic for a novel that came out in the 1930s is currently my fanfic is for about me and an audience of like 8 other people.
Yeah, it's and the lovely thing about fan fiction is that you're always going to find the people who get you, because only a handful of people are ever going to read that one weird specific trope that you love in this IP that maybe like 30 other people have ever seen in their life. Mm-hmm. Like that's kind of that's why I love fan fiction personally, because it is kind of the only place where writing really is still for me, whereas publishing, now I was an editor before I became a published author, and I have an editor brain, but that's actually very different from published author brain, because published author brain isn't about whether or not the book is good. It's whether or not people will like me. And that's a very different kind of detrimental thought process to have as a creator, right? You're not, because you're no longer thinking about what is the best story, is what's best for the book, what's best for this narrative I'm trying to craft, or what do I want to explore in this, and how do I want to explore it? You don't really think about that, or you are always trying to go back to that, rather, as a published author, rather than, being, maybe some people can tune it out entirely. I mean, I really envy them if they can, but, tuning that out is really, really, really hard. So I actually want to talk about, I actually don't want to talk about this, but I feel like I want to talk about it with you, which is the issue of representation in a book, because I dislike this conversation when people ask me about representation in my books. My first 2 books are set in 18th century Bavaria, which is, again, why Nita and I are friends. And I often used to get a lot of questions about, well, why didn't you write an Asian-inspired book? And because that wasn't the story I wanted to tell, but also it really shouldn't matter whether or not it was Asian-inspired or not. And my protagonist shares a lot of things with me, namely my bipolar disorder. But I didn't want to make my first 2 books about an issue, which is, I think, what a lot of people end up reducing books to in a discussion about representation, quote unquote. And then, this is the other thing I hate, as I think you've maybe touched on, is that this is the first time a protagonist has shared part of your identity, and then you feel like, oh God, I have to make this character unimpeachable so that it's not a bad queer, right? Or anything like that, that you feel like, again, like trying to turn all of those things off. And do you have tips, tricks, or how do you bulldoze through the fear, or any of those sorts of things?
So at least for me, so with who I was with her, I did actually combat that a little bit, because who I was with her, my protagonist is obviously bisexual. That's a big part of the story for her. But when I was writing her, I was like, I was very much inspired by Courtney Summers, who is another YA author who writes very on purpose unlikable girls. And I was writing Corinne, I was like, I literally do not care if people like her. I don't want people to like her. She's 17. She makes a lot of really selfish choices. And so for me, at least for that particular character, I was like, I don't care if people, I actually am more pleased if they don't like her, because then I did my job. Because she's selfish. She's a teenager. She's a teenager going through this very, very intense process of grief. So at least for her, I was like, okay, that's fine if people don't like her. So that was helpful. For Nothing Sung, it was a little bit different. And I don't even know if I really have tips for ignoring that, other than I block Twitter on my phone and don't go on it, because for Charlie and for the other girls, it was very much like, for Charlie, the balance I had to have with her, because she lives during 1930s Nazi Germany, and her arc is very, very slowly realizing, oh, something's not right here, and it's not fair that my Jewish friends can't do the same things I can, and it's actually bad things are going on here. So her entire arc is her waking up to that. And I had to balance, okay, we as readers, obviously, from a 2022 perspective, going into this, know that Nazi Germany is bad and Nazis are bad. How do I get in this girl's perspective of realizing that something is bad while still making her sympathetic, but also not too naive? Because if she's too naive, then it's not believable.
Right.
So
hard to empathize with that.
Extremely, yeah. So for me, it was trying to figure that out. And I actually, now that I'm answering this out loud, think that was kind of how I bulldozed through or ignored the kind of the thoughts of audiences. For me, it became more of a, like, literally from a craft perspective. I was like, okay, how am I going to make this character sympathetic? Like, what? Looking at it more from, like, the craft of, okay, what can I do here to make her sympathetic versus making her naive, and more approaching it, like, from the writing aspect of it without so much thinking of, like, capital T Twitter discourse.
Right.
I don't know. For me, I think for me, that's kind of always been the thing I find useful, is trying to focus on story. But then again, you know, talking about representation, talking about everything is, I agree with you, it's difficult, and it gets very frustrating for me as well, and particularly from a marketing standpoint. It's so frustrating because I'll get books, like, recommended to me, and they're like, oh, like, it has a queer love interest and a queer story, and I'm like, great, what's the plot? Like, at this point, the conversation, I feel like, has become so reductive that, for me at least, it's very frustrating to see books pushed on representation alone. Like, okay, at that point, that just because there is representation does not mean it's a good story. And at this point, I'm more invested in story. If it has queer characters, great. I will, you know, read the mess out of it. But I'd rather know the plot. I'd rather there know the conflict in the story than, like, okay, great, these characters are queer and one of them has ADHD. Fantastic. How does that inform the plot?
Yeah, I feel that I have had some difficulties reading books for the past couple of years, to be completely honest. And I, you know, go through periods of reading ruts and not. But I think it's not actually a problem with the book. I think it's the way the books are being marketed to me. Because often I will find a book and I just love it. And it's actually, I don't have a problem reading it. You know, it's not like I have difficulty getting into it or getting emotionally attached. But I don't want to pick it up because I'm not being told anything about this book aside from a list of tropes. And I really, sometimes I just want to be like, look, I know the vibes are impeccable, but what is the story? Like, I don't really care about vibes, or rather, vibes are not enough. I want to know what I'm in for. I want to know what journey I'm going to be going on. And if you say, oh, there was only one bed, I'm like, great, so does a million other fanfics. And I at least know what I'm going to get out of all of those.
If I want only one bed, I'm going to go to AO3 and go to the X-Files.
Exactly. Right? I know exactly what I'm going to get, but I don't have that level of trust yet with a lot of writers and a lot of books. So sometimes when I get marketed a whole bunch of tropes, I'm like, yes, but what is it about? What's the story about? So I don't really like to talk about books that way. However, I am going to ask you, what is your favorite list of tropes, and are they in any of your books?
Cool. Okay. I feel so overdone. I'm so sorry. I really do enjoy enemies to lovers, but I am also just love a toxic relationship in a story. Please give me two people that should not be together and yet are. I will read that in literally any iteration. I like that trope in fiction. I'm not a tropes person is the thing. Whenever I get asked that, I'm like, enemies to lovers is my main one, but like, if I'm thinking like a list of fanfic tropes, I like hurt comfort, but that's more of a genre than anything. So I mean, like, I tend to like angst, but like, if it's like there's only one bed, you know, again, I'll read that in fan fiction, but in my books, not so much. I will say, I take it back. I do have a toxic relationship, and nothing's actually probably who I was with her too, depending on how you read that book. Nothing sung and nothing spoken for me was deliberately like, okay, the weird homoerotic relationship you have with your best friend who is also a girl in high school, and neither of you are ever going to acknowledge that you're probably into each other.
Yeah, it's do I like her? Do I want to be with? Like, do I want to be her? Or be with her is always the eternal question, right?
Yeah. Yep. So for that one was what I was deliberately trying to pull on an answer for this particular book, and I really hadn't. I admit it. I looked at a Goodreads review, and someone's like, "I really don't like Gailey. She and Charlie are good for each other," and I'm like, "Yes, good."
You're like, that's the point.
They are not supposed to be. So that's probably the trope I enjoy most. What about you?
Oh gosh, I actually don't like enemies to lovers, which is kind of weird because everybody kind of categorizes my first two books that way. But I don't because it's like, I don't know how many of y'all have seen Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Yeah.
But the eternal question is, are you a Zutara shipper or a Katang shipper? And this is where Nita and I diverge.
What place we diverge?
It's why we're not the same person, actually. This is the one place, because I am a Katang shipper. I don't like, personally, like, they just, like, Katara and Zuko, well, I love them both. Particularly, I love Zuko a lot. He's my baby. They don't actually like each other. And while I see that there is romantic potential for this ship, in the actual text of the show, they, one, don't spend a lot of time together, and two, spend most of it hating each other. So I personally, whereas you have 3 seasons, and also I do prefer friends to lovers as a trope in my fiction. So I also do like there's only one bed, but again, it has to be, for me, it's all about execution. I will read almost anything. Even tropes I dislike, because it's easier for me to come up with tropes I don't like. Like, I don't really like enemies to lovers. I don't really like love triangles.
There's a love triangle and nothing, so I'm so sorry.
I know. It's okay. It's the only reason I would say it's not that I dislike it in theory or principle. It's often the execution that I don't like, which is the person in the middle never ends up with the person I want them to end up with, or it doesn't end in a poly relationship, which is where it should go if it's a triangle. So, but yeah, those are basically mine. But I heard the signal, or saw the signal, that we should probably be wrapping this up. And yeah, so for audience questions. So why don't we open it up? I think, would you be open to answering not just about your book, but about other things?
Yes.
Publishing, stuff that you like, German language musicals, all of that is on the table. So, you guys have any questions for us?
So I cried an unreasonable amount of tears with your first book. Should I expect to go through a whole other box of tissues with this one?
It's worse. I'm so sorry. I cried writing this one, and I didn't cry writing who I was with her. So this one gets so much more. So yes, the answer to that is yes. Feel free to be prepared.
So you said Gailey's name is pronounced Gailey?
Oh, fun. Yep, German pronunciation.
Yeah, that's literally my question. Just like, how do you pronounce things? And that little thing that looks like an S that's not an S.
The sharp S.
Yes, I just want pronunciation, so I'm reading this. My head can be aligned correctly, or I'm going to be slightly annoyed the whole time.
There. Okay, so quick rundown. The Schaffes S, the fun little funky bee looking thing, is just a double S, so you can replace it with 2 S's. As far as names go in the book, also I will say I did listen to my own audiobook today, and my narrator is a fluent German speaker, so she's fantastic and pronounced everything perfectly, which I'm super, super thrilled by. So if audiobooks are your jam, I do recommend the audiobook of this. As far as names go, for Gailey, it's Angelika is her name, so Gailey is the nickname. Charlotte, not Charlotte, Charlotte, so Charlie. Renata, and then Minna, so are the 4 main girls. So
Thank you.
You're welcome. As far as the rest of the German in the book, I cannot help you unless you want
I
like
muddle
me
through. I just
reading
need
it.
the names correct, so as I'm reading it, I'm not
And
reading the whole time.
Greta for Greta is what you would say in English. Yeah. Yes.
So I think that there's so much of you and your hobbies and interests in your first book that were like fun little Easter eggs for people who knew you. But I'm curious about if that was a challenge in writing your current book, since it was historical. Like, how were there ways where you were able to, put in little things like that and hobbies and interests for your characters, but not things that are now?
Oh, thank you. That is such a good question because to me, so much of me is in this book anyway, and purely from that, it's just the really the deep love I have for the German language is kind of throughout this entire book since it's set in Germany. So I think that was the biggest thing for me, was putting that in there. And I actually, with the exception of the translation at the beginning of the book, I did the rest of the translations myself. So that's more of the Easter egg in this one, is if there is German in there and it's translated, that was me. So that's kind of the fun little thing that I got to do for this one. As far as, hobbies go, Charlie is, she draws maps for fun. I do not draw at all. So I have no idea why that came out. I have no idea why that was her hobby, but it ended up fitting thematically with the rest of the book. So, yeah. One of these days I'll write a book where someone plays Dungeons and Dragons. It'll have to not be a historical.
Choose your own adventure.
Any other questions? Literally anything. Just ask anything.
Seriously.
We'll answer anything.
Oh God.
I'll ask one. So since I was around, obviously, through most of the research of this, I think it's really interesting that we've talked a little bit about the ideas of gender and German national identity and how those really got intertwined very closely during the Nazi regime. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting that you sort of placed all your characters on different points along that spectrum. Could you talk a little bit about each of the characters' relationship to gender, German national identity, that sort of thing?
Thank you. Thank you. That's a great question. So it was so interesting to play around with, because German itself is a very, very gendered language, like most non-English languages. There are 3 genders in German. There's masculine, feminine, and neutral, at least for objects. German non-binariness is a whole other issue. But for me, I really did want to kind of showcase that spectrum of both gender identity and, like you said, like national identity as well. So, like, for example, Charlie, at least at the beginning of the book, doesn't really question the party, doesn't really question kind of anything about herself or about, anything in her life. And then kind of almost on the opposite side of that, we have Renata, who is my butch character, who I love, and who also very much is like, hates the party, hates everything it stands for, but also kind of comes from a slightly different working class background than Charlie, where she and her family do hate the party and do hate kind of what it stands for. And then literally on the opposite side from Renata, you have Gailey, whose father is an officer, but who also is the more feminine out of the group of girls and kind of adheres to this very traditional German standard of this is what a good German girl is supposed to look like, but also at the same time plays with that because she doesn't know she wears lipstick, she wears makeup, she wears nail polish, which girls at the time were highly discouraged from doing because they were all supposed to look like perfect little Hausfrau and perfect little like mothers for the party, and anything that encouraged individuality or vanity was severely frowned upon. So, and to top that off, Gailey also comes from a different class than Charlie and Renata. She's a much more upper class. Her father's an officer. They have money. She goes to a gymnasium, which is the school that will let her go on to university, whereas the other girls go to a Realschule, which don't exist anymore, actually. Which the diploma they get from that school does not allow them to go to university. So they are literally, the class divide between them is different as well. So for me, it was important and very exciting to show all of these different gender identities, national identities, and kind of have this spectrum, particularly along these 3 girls, because I wanted to showcase as much of the like everyday experience for Germans as possible.
Other questions?
So the question was, have I thought about writing about like gay deaf experiences, etc.? So on one hand, yes, I have. On the other, because I'm not deaf myself, that's not. I am hearing. True, I am hearing. So I would want to put some of that experience into a book at some point. There is a little bit of it in here, but not like Igdy culturally deaf. Renata's hard of hearing in this book, and for me that was more of a like, how do we see like disability during the Nazi, I don't know how to sign regime, but regime at the time. But I am definitely not opposed to it. That's a bad pun. I would love to include more like deaf experiences, deaf culture and characters within the book. For me, it just would not be the point of view character that I'm writing. They would usually be hearing, because that's what I am. Maybe in the future. It's very hard to sign with a microphone.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes, so if there's any final questions, we can answer that. Otherwise, I think we could probably start wrapping up. But I hope you guys all have your copies of Nita's books. I think you've already signed stock, right?
I have. If you came in a little later and would like something signed or want it personalized, or if you have not signed my copy of the book over there, which is my little yearbook. Thank you to Erica for writing "Have a Great Summer" in it. If you have not signed that, I really would actually like you to. This is the first live event that I have ever done as an author, so I wanted like a little memorial for that. So please sign it if you haven't. If you have not gotten a book signed, or if you're my friend and we didn't get a photo and you would like a photo, we can do that too at the end.
All right. Well, thank you for coming. Let's give Nita a round of applause.